Afternoon. I said good afternoon. First and foremost, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us for today's History's Lunch program, which is taking place in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium here at the two Mississippi Museums. Let me give a special thanks to the Southern Poverty Law Center for providing lunch for today's program. Want to shout out my good friend Lolita Bolden back there. Let's give her a hand. Before we begin today's program, I want to take a few moments to recognize Senator David Jordan. Is he still here? Senator Jordan, thank you so much for spending time in our galleries this morning, sharing your story with our audience, and for always supporting these museums. Really do appreciate you. Well, today I get the honor and pleasure of introducing a few folks that made me possible, to be quite honest with you. We're excited to welcome Dr. Leslie-Burl McLemore, Dr. Michelle Deardorff, and Dr. Jeff Kolnick as we commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. Today, actually, August the 6th, marks 60 years since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Dr. McLemore is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Jackson State University, a civil rights movement veteran who worked closely with leaders like Fannie Lou Hamer and helped found the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Dr. Michelle Deardorff is the Adolph Ox Professor of Government and Department Head at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. And you're going to correct me on that one, for sure. Dr. Jeff Kolnick was a history professor at Southwest Minnesota State. And if he looks very, very relieved, that's because he recently retired. In 1997, McLemore, Deardorff, and Kolnick founded the Fannie Lou Hamer National Institute on Citizenship and Democracy, which aimed to expand the meaning, scope, and practice of citizenship and democracy in America. And in about 2011, they did something pretty remarkable. They hired me as a graduate assistant to work on that program, and then they hired me back the next summer. Without further ado, help me welcome Dr. Deardorff, Dr. Leslie-Burl McLemore, and Dr. Kolnick.
That's Leslie-Burl McLemore at 23. Wasn't he handsome? On the surface, at least, the beginning and the end of Mississippi politics is the Negro. He has no hand in the voting, no part in factional maneuvers, no seat in the legislature. Nevertheless, he fixes the tone so far as the outside world is concerned of Mississippi. In 1949. In 1949, I was 9 years old, and Charles Henry Holmes was 12. Of course, things have changed since 1949, in the Mississippi legislature at least. In the state legislature in the House, there are 44 African-American members out of 122. That's 36% of the group. In the Mississippi Senate, there were 13. David left, John Horn left. But anyway, when I wrote this, it was 13 out of 52. That was 25%, so it's less than 25% now. But clearly, V.O. Key understood the impact of black folk on the vote in Mississippi in 1949. So the right to vote is an ongoing struggle, and the struggle continues today, a fight that most of us thought we had won after the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. According to Professor Earl Lewis, and I quote, "Negro voting in Mississippi is a post-Civil War phenomenon. Unlike several other former slave states, free Negroes were not permitted to vote in Mississippi prior to 1860. There were 773 free Negroes in Mississippi in 1860. Essentially, from 1873 to 1944, blacks were eliminated from the political process. They could not vote. There were 60,000 more blacks than whites in 1875 in Mississippi during the end of Reconstruction. The 1890 Constitution implemented the Mississippi Plan. The plan imposed the poll tax and arbitrary literacy tests. It is the manifest intention of this convention to secure to the state of Mississippi white supremacy. The Journal of Proceedings from the 1890 Constitution. I will agree that this is a government by the people and for the people. But what people? When this declaration was made by our forefathers, it was for the Anglo-Saxon people. That is what we are here for today, to secure the supremacy of the white race, even if it does sacrifice some of my white children or white neighbors or their children, end of quote, which also meant that he had some black children. And this is J.H. McGee. He was a delegate at the convention of 1890. The powers that be used the 1890 Constitution and political violence to disenfranchise the black population. U.S. Senator Theodore Bilbo was one of the leading advocates for the use of violence to eliminate blacks from the political process. The Supreme Court constitutionally sanctioned the white primary in 1935. However, 10 years later, in 1944, the court reversed its position in the case of Smith versus Allwright. Senator Bilbo wanted to test the Smith versus Allwright decision. So in 1946, he decided to test the case. This is Senator Bilbo speaking. He said, and I quote, these are the words of Bilbo, "I call on every red-blooded white man to use any means to keep the niggers away from the polls. If you don't understand what that means, you're just plain dumb. I'm calling on every red-blooded American who believes in the superiority and integrity of the white race to get out and see that no nigger votes, and the best time to do it is the night before." End of quote. Senator Bilbo, elected by the people of Mississippi. So to give you some idea of the difficulty that black people had voting moving forward, these are figures from, well, 1946. In Adams County, there were 10,344 white people, 16,8885 blacks. There were 3,371 whites registered, 147 blacks registered. 0 blacks voted. Let's look at Hinds County, Big Hinds. White population, 51,826. Black population, 55,445. Registered whites, 27,386. Registered blacks, 414. Blacks voted, 195. Can you imagine how courageous they were? 195 black folk went to the polls in 1946 after Bilbo talked about niggas like that, and they showed up to vote. My adopted county, Marshall County, 7,556 whites, 17,965 blacks, 2,370 whites registered, 17 black folk registered. In Marshall County, Mississippi in 1946, 17 brave black people. I went to school in Marshall County, and I knocked on doors to get people registered to vote in 1962 moving forward. And I had no idea at the time that when I was 6 years old, 17 black people were registered to vote in Marshall County. And on election day, 5 of them voted. Think about that. In Mississippi, 1946, in rural Marshall County, Mississippi, 5 courageous black folk went to the polls to register and vote. And I remember taking people to the polls to register to vote, threatened by the county sheriff, stood in the doorway, said I couldn't come in. Now, this was 1962. Used Mr. Nero's car to take him to the polls, and they threatened Mr. Nero because they took his license number down. Said they were going to shoot him. But 5 courageous people went to the polls. So, they told me I had 10 minutes, so I'm going to move forward. But my colleagues have agreed, since I'm the senior member of this group, that I can take 11 minutes. The appointment of Medgar Evers in 1954 as the first permanent field secretary of the NAACP developed a network. Evers developed a network between 1954 and 1961. But then just think about Medgar Evers in 1954. Anybody who was of age at that time, just think about what you were doing in 1954. I know Charles Henry remembers. I'm not sure. Oh, David Jordan remembers. A few other people in here, because most of you are youngsters. So y'all wouldn't remember 1954. But I remember 1954 when I heard the Brown versus Board decision. I was chopping cotton on the Joe Sanders plantation, talking to my second double cousin, Essie Lee Rice. And she decided she was going to go to the Catholic school, and I decided I was going to go to the white school in Lake Cumberland. Of course, Essie Lee didn't go to the Catholic school, and I didn't go to the white school in Lake Cumberland, but we were talking about it. This was 1954. But Medgar Evers decided to become the first-time field secretary of the NAACP in 1954. Just think of how brave that was. So between 54 and 61, the networking that Medgar Evers developed, the branches of the NAACP. Don't ever forget that the foundation for the modern-day civil rights movement really began when Medgar Evers and Murley, but Medgar decided to become head of the NAACP, field secretary. and he developed the branches throughout Mississippi, even in small town Mississippi, where the president of the NAACP would deny that he or she was not president, because that could get you killed. It was different in places like Jackson and some of the larger cities, but in Walls, where I'm from, or in Alligator, or in Hot Coffee, some of these places could get you killed. So So 7 years between 54 and 61. Bob Moses moved into Southwest Mississippi. It was probably the most creative act anyone in the New Left has attempted. Certainly, much of the subsequent history of the New Left has flowed from that essential act of Moses, disappearing alone in the most violent and desolate section of Mississippi in 1961. How many of you were 18 years old or 15 years old in 1961? Let me see some hands. Okay, you were older than that. All of you old people, what were you doing in 1961? Teaching. Bob Moses. This is one of the most historic acts in the history of Mississippi. When Bob Moses moved into Southwest Mississippi in 1961. It says that Moses disappeared alone into the most violent and desolate section of Mississippi in 1961. Some of us were teaching. I was a student at Rush College. So many of you who were of age were not involved in the movement. But this guy from New York came to Southwest Mississippi. Now, he really didn't appear alone. With him was Reggie Robinson and John Hardy. So the name Reggie Robinson and John Hardy should be somewhere in this museum, right? Just think how brave they were in 1961 to go into one of the most violent sections of Mississippi in 1961. Now, the above the ground civil rights movement starts in Macomb in 1961. That's why the Macomb display in this museum is large. And Michael, I don't know where he is, but Michael, it ought to be larger. Because Macomb set the tone for what happened as we move forward. Because out of Macomb, out of 1961, the next year, Fannie Lou Hamer was discovered in Sunflower County, Mississippi, by Bob Moses and SNCC. In 1962, Reverend Merrill Winston Lindsay ran for the U.S. Congress, and Reverend R.L.T. Smith ran for the U.S. Congress. In 1962, the first blacks to run for the Congress since Reconstruction. That was Bob Moses. That's 1962. So what Moses did in 1961, as I move on, is significant. It's really important. We ought to find a place in this museum to have this quote someplace. So when you enter the museum, it says that the founding of the above ground civil rights movement in 1961 started here by this Moses guy. That's why I've been pushing Katie and Michael and other people to name a lecture series in honor of Bob Moses. I haven't gotten very far, but they did agree to have a session like this once per year in the name of Bob Moses. And then they agreed to, on one day of the year, to have people come in free in honor of Bob Moses. And there was something else they guaranteed, but I can't remember that. But the museum is large enough for Moses and Medgar Evers. Michael? Quote, last night there was a statement made that I initiated or started the movement, but anyone who thinks must know that I couldn't have done that because I wasn't from Macomb. As far as I know, things don't get started by somebody who is not from someplace just going in cold turkey and figuring that they are going to start something. C.C. Bryant was the person who actually started this thing. This is Bob Moses talking. And he was right. He's exactly right, because C.C. Bryant was there when Moses came to Macomb in 1961. But also he was wrong from the standpoint is that he was right and Moses was right. Because Moses was from New York. He went to live there with Reggie Robinson and John Hardy. So when we kick off this Moses Appreciation Day, Michael, we need to invite Reggie Robinson and John Hardy so they can be here, because Moses is going to heaven. So, but he was exactly right. So what they did that was unusual, they moved to Macomb and they lived with the people. So out of Macomb came all the things I mentioned. Out of Macomb came the 1963 Freedom Vote campaign. Out of Macomb came the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Out of Macomb came the Summer Project. And that started with Bob Moses and those two guys in Macomb, Mississippi, because they were about obtaining the right to vote in a state that even now, according to V.O. Key, as early as 1949, because of the presence of black people in the population. So we are now, 2025. We still have a large percentage of black people in the population, and we still have some of the same issues. There was an election yesterday in DeSoto County, Mississippi. 2 black persons were nominated for the state senate because they had gerrymandered the districts in Macomb, Mississippi. Mississippi has mastered the art of gerrymandering. And they have mastered the art of gerrymandering because 38% of the population in this state is black. And then we have this guy in Washington who is trying to turn back the clock. Now, I had one more slide, and that's of Aaron Henry and at Russ College. And I had the slide of me behind Joe Rao. And you can't see me, but I'm behind Rao. And I put that slide up there because I wanted y'all to know that I was at the Democratic Founding Convention in Jackson in 1964. So you can't hardly see me because my colleague Jeff Kolnick is going to talk about the Freedom Democratic Party and the right to vote. So I guess my time is up, so I guess I'll stop.
Hey everyone, I think I got a pointer here. There's Leslie there. Yeah. Behind Joe Rao. Yeah, there he is again. Gray hair there. See? And there he is again, there at Atlantic City. Danny Devine.
The handsome guy, next Danny Devine.
All right, let's give it up again for Dr. McLemore. So I'm going to tell a story about the finding Mississippi and the story of the Voting Rights Act. And This first slide is the citizens of Mileston, Mississippi, electing delegates to the MFDP State Convention in Jackson in 1964. And I think that when we think about the Voting Rights Act, we too often don't think about Mississippi. We think about Selma to Montgomery, and I want to kind of unpack that a little bit, all right? So I want to thank the two museums. I want to thank Michael for inviting us down and his fabulous team and making all this possible. It's good to be back in Mississippi, and thank you all for coming. What a great crowd. As I get older, I'm more interested in how popular interpretations of major historical events are created than I am in piecing together the narratives of what happened from the facts. So today I want to talk about the role of the Freedom Democratic Party in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in popular memory, and the ways that too few people understand the pivotal role it played in passing that act. To do that, we need to take a road trip to Selma. If you have time, I mean, you can kind of look at this state historical marker there. In his autobiography, lovingly compiled by Professor Claiborne Carson, and I recommend people look at it, called The Autobiography of Martin Luther King, Dr. King set down a marker in 1965 about the role of Selma in the struggle for voting rights. Quote, when SCLC went into Selma in 1965, it had limited objectives. It sought primarily to correct the wrongs existing in that small city. But our adversaries met us with such unrestrained brutality that they enlarged the issue to the national scale. The ironic and splendid result was nothing less than the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He goes on later in the same essay he wrote in 1965 to say, quote, Selma brought us the voting bill. 30 years later, Dr. King's marker was taken up by Congressman John Lewis in 1995 when he returned to the Edmund Pettus Bridge to commemorate the events of Bloody Sunday of March 1965. Since then, this commemoration has been repeated annually with growing importance. It is covered by most major media. Elected officials of both parties join in the march. Alabama tourism highlights the event, as does the Alabama ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center. While the event highlights the work left to be done and focuses on the erosion of voting rights in the years since the Shelby decision, and while it is careful not to claim that Selma led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act, in the popular mind, Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery March has been cemented into memory as the civil rights event that brought about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the sound bites that cover the commemorations, little attention is paid to the Dallas County Voters League. And if you don't know about the Dallas County Voters League, that's another inspiring story. And the long struggle for civil rights and voting rights that characterize that community. In other words, the organizing tradition and the local people are largely left out. In public memory, commemorations matter, and regarding civil rights history, Alabama has been busier than other states. An example of this can be found on the National ACLU webpage that sets out a timeline of voting rights activity going from 1866 to 2016. The timeline stops briefly in 1964 to note the passage of the 24th Amendment outlawing the poll tax, and then moves to Bloody Sunday and the passage of the Voting Rights Act, skipping entirely the Freedom Democratic Party. The official page of the United States Senate devoted to the Voting Rights Act begins this way, quote, on August 4th, 1965, the United States Senate passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The long-delayed issue of voting rights had come to the forefront because of a voter registration drive launched by civil rights activists in Selma, Alabama. That's how the U.S. Senate commemorates the Voting Rights Act at the start of its page. And I could go on. There are many, many examples of this. If Selma looms large in the memory of Voting Rights Act, how has the Summer Project been remembered in the popular mind? Well, in an interview with Julian Bond, Bob Moses, who we've just heard about, had this to say about the work that he did in Mississippi on voting rights. Quote, this is talking about the Mississippi movement. I think we got Jim Crow out of public accommodations, access to the vote, and the National Democratic Party structure, but we didn't get it out of education. So I think it is as the unfinished, I think of it as the unfinished business. So he says that in Mississippi, we got access to the Democratic Party and we got access to the vote. He's claiming that. Unfortunately, Bob Moses' analysis has not had the same resonance as Dr. King's or nearly 30 years of commemorating Bloody Sunday. Rather than those accomplishments, the Center of Public Memory in the Summer Project has been on the Summer Volunteers and the 3 slain civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. Freedom Summer has become a powerful black and white together story in the face of the brutality of racist state and local governments in Mississippi. Outrageously, and despite strong criticisms from within the civil rights community, too many Americans learned about the Summer Project from the 1988 film Mississippi Burning. To the extent that people learn more about the Summer Project, they might encounter the Freedom Schools, with still fewer learning about Mrs. Hamer and the Freedom Democratic Party. Interpretively, the Summer Project fills a space in the popular memory as the antecedent for a story of declension, when the movement became bitter about white liberals, bitter about working within the system, and bitter about working with white people more generally. And regarding the MFDP, the focus is typically on 2 things: Mrs. Hamer's speech at the Democratic National Convention and the rejection of the compromise offered to the Freedom Democrats. Sadly, in the national narrative, LBJ throws shade on Mrs. Hamer with his quickly called press conference, but she is redeemed in the popular narrative because her speech is played in full on the nightly news. As for the compromise, almost the only part anyone refers to are the 2 at-large seats offered to the Freedom Democrats and Mrs. Hamer's charge to her fellow Democrats, quote, "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats." To understand the role of the MFDP in securing the Voting Rights Act, we need to think more carefully about the 3 parts of the Atlantic City Compromise and extend the story into 1965 and the congressional challenge. The first part of the compromise was that the 2 at-large seats, with the delegates being chosen by the Democratic Party. This part of the compromise was a slap in the face to the delegates and an insult too deep for the Freedom Democrats to forgive in the context of that entire summer and all of those events. The next 2 parts of the compromise were in essence a promise by the National Democratic Party to never seat another segregated delegation again at a Democratic National Convention. And I think if you really kind of think about what I just said there, and you can read it right there, that was a promise that there would be a Voting Rights Act before 1968. This excluded almost all of the, the next 2 parts of the compromise were in essence a promise by the Democratic Party to never seat another segregated delegation again at a Democratic National Convention. The compromise stipulated that no delegation would be seated that did not pledge to vote for the Democratic ticket in 1964. This excluded almost all of the official Mississippi delegation that had pledged to vote for Barry Goldwater in their state convention. The compromise also called for the creation of a committee to change the rules of the party to exclude segregated delegations at all future national conventions. This public pledge all but guaranteed a Voting Rights Act in advance of the 1968 convention. The Democratic Party dominated every branch of government in 1964. After Atlantic City, the only question that remained was not if, but when there would be a voting rights bill. If the Summer Project proved anything, it was without a strong and enforced federal voting rights law, the state of Mississippi, and with it the entire Jim Crow South, would continue to send segregated delegations to the national conventions year after year, and movements by black citizens that threatened white monopoly political power would be met with lethal violence. The impact of the compromise, unaccepted by the MFDP, caused most of the segregationist Mississippi delegation to leave the convention. They understood the writing on the wall, and within 4 years, they would be on their way to migrating into the Republican Party in national elections. Whether accepted or not, the deal for the Voting Rights Act was cut in Atlantic City. What was left was to determine the timing. In contrast to popular memory, the history of the MFDP did not end on the boardwalk at Atlantic City. COFO and the MFDP remained active in 1964, campaigning for Johnson and the MFDP congressional challenge during the 1965 session of Congress. On December 4th, after the election, 1964, MFDP filed official notice with the House of Representatives that they would challenge the election of the 3 Mississippi congressional districts where Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Gray, and Annie Devine ran on the Freedom ballot. For the next 6 months, the MFDP was at work in Mississippi and in Washington, battling Congress over the right of 3 white Mississippi congressmen to take their seats. Thus, during the high tide of the Selma March, Selma movement on the streets in Alabama, MFDP was in the halls of Congress challenging white power directly at the same time, pushing for a voting rights bill in the Congress itself. There was no let-up after Atlantic City, and it was happening parallel to the movement in Selma. MFDP continued to be active into 1968 and a little bit beyond. Its legacy in terms of organizing strategy, parallel institution building, and in extracting from the Democratic Party a promise to end Jim Crow in the party has been underappreciated in scholarship and particularly in the master narrative of the civil rights movement and broader interpretations of US history, where it's essentially absent entirely. Compared to a march and a police riot on a bridge, Freedom Summer is hard to summarize and commemorate in a clear, simple message reduced to an 8 to 12 second soundbite required by modern media companies. Freedom Summer does not have an Edmund Pettus bridge, and Dr. King, still the centerpiece of the national civil rights narrative, was not a central player in the Summer Project. But here, in this sacred space, we can set the record straight and put the Summer Project and the MFDP at the center of the voting rights struggle for first-class citizenship in the United States of America. In the face of the attacks on voting rights in our own time, it is essential that we make room at the center of that story for Mississippi, Alabama, and other movement locations that all contributed mightily to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I just want to share one other thing in closing. Yesterday, as I was going over my notes, I received a notification from historian Heather Cox Richardson, who is probably the most widely read historian in the United States now. And she published a almost 5-minute video in commemoration of the Voting Rights Act yesterday. It's 5 minutes long. It has a cartoonist drawing a nice picture. Mississippi received about 8 seconds of that 5-minute video, and the rest focused on Selma, Alabama. Within 45 minutes, it had 66,000 views. It's had 180,000 views now and been shared 10,000 times. So one of the most widely read historians today did the same thing yesterday, right? And that's on your web pages today. So thank you for your time, and I'll give it up to Michelle here.
So what I'm going to talk about is the erosion of the Voting Rights Act. So I get the less uplifting part. So let's start with Shelby and what Shelby does. But first, let's go to the language of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I think it's really important to remember our right to vote as citizens is not rooted in the Voting Rights Act. It is rooted in the Constitution of the United States, right? Where it is clearly guaranteed, both on the basis of race and on the basis of gender, it cannot be denied, in the Constitution. The Voting Rights Act is to ensure that state and local governments extend those rights and provide those rights, but it is not the source of those rights. And so there's three sections of the Voting Rights Act I want to mention because I'm going to be talking about in the next few minutes. The first is Section 2. And Section 2 makes it clear that any voting practices by state and local governments cannot discriminate on the basis of race, color, or membership in specific language minority groups, because this is clearly responding to historical realities at that time, right? The way in which voting was being denied people. The second element was Section 4, particularly Clause B, which laid out the requirements to be a protected jurisdiction. And these were jurisdictions that we'll look at in a minute that had explicitly engaged in activity to deny people the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or language minority groups. And then Section 5 clearly states the federal government has jurisdiction over these areas that have a history of racial discrimination. And before they can make any changes in their voting policies, it has to be approved by the Justice Department or federal court to ensure that the change would expand the right to vote, not restrict it. So that's what the Voting Rights Act does explicitly. what's the impact? And Leslie talked a little bit about this, what that impact was. But as you can see, it basically was a vast extension of the right to vote, to where you see very few people voting prior to the civil rights, African Americans voting in the South and Mississippi. It raises to over 50%. So we see this huge turnout. We see the disparity between black and white voting participation dropping from, what was it, they said almost 30% in the early 1960s to an 8% gap. So turnout becomes consistent and less based on race. And then finally, there's been a lot of research that looked at the positive relationship between the Voting Rights Act on racial economic equality and falling arrest rates. We'll get back to that in a minute. And these counties with larger black populations. So very positive impact politically. Black elected officials, right? I mean, all sorts of things changed. These are the counties and states and jurisdictions that were covered by Section 5 by the time we get to Shelby in 2013. So as you can see, Mississippi, the entire state is covered under Section 5. So anytime the state of Mississippi tries to pass a law dealing with voting, it had to be approved federally before it could go into effect. And then you see that there's some counties, and then there's a few townships, there are townships in Michigan up at the top that are covered because of previous acts of racial discrimination. So we get to Shelby County versus Holder, which I think most people have certainly heard of. And in this case, the court is looking at some decisions in Alabama. Alabama has appealed that the policies they're trying to pass were being denied by the Justice Department, and the court agrees. And the court, in a decision written by the Chief Justice Rehnquist, says that, you know, we have, as he says here, the blight of racial discrimination in voting has infected the electoral process in many parts of our country for nearly a century, but these have changed. And so the statute's current burden must be justified by current needs. And any disparate geographic coverage must be sufficiently related to the problem. In other words, the formula worked in 1965, but it no longer works here. And so, I'm sorry, that's not Chief Justice Rehnquist all this time, and I have not noticed that's there. It's Roberts, so I apologize. It is Roberts. And so his opinion is essentially that, yes, there was racial discrimination in voting, and he calls it a blight, right? There's this blight of racial discrimination in voting that had infected our country, but had been resolved by 2013. And so now we're choosing who gets covered under this based on what he calls decades-old data and eradicated practices. And so as a such, it's, you know, these practices have been banned for decades, and so why are we still making decisions based on this? Now, Ruth Bader Ginsburg disagrees. And her argument is pretty simple. Voting discrimination still exists, and no one's debating that. And so by removing this, all we're doing is blowing that racial discrimination back into light. And she gives this famous example, this wonderful quote that she says, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And so her argument was that Section 5 was doing its job. And so we weren't seeing the same parallels, the same things we'd seen in the 60s and prior to that because it was working. So what's the impact to Shelby? Well, you immediately see, and I'm going to talk particularly, what's up here is what's kind of the larger findings. I want to talk specifically what happens in Mississippi. There's a wonderful handout that that's coming out of the Southern Poverty Center, law school center is that articulates a lot of these changes. There's a report that's coming out soon that has very specifically the impact and a lot of the data that's available. But big picture, one of the first things that happened is there was a law that had already been passed regarding photo ID laws. And the Justice Department had prevented its implementation in Mississippi and many other places. And it was implemented basically as soon as Shelby came down. There were very limited and narrow vote by mail rules. There were changes made to make voter registration more difficult. Very restricted. You have some of the most restrictive absentee ballot voting in the country. Between 20 and 22, there were almost polling places were closed. They were moved. Over 100 were changed, often without public announcement on the website so people would know where to vote. To vote, I'm in Tennessee now. In Tennessee, we can vote for weeks prior to Election Day. There are set polling places all over the city. We can go vote, and so if you can't vote on Election Day, you have plenty of other times to go vote. That's not the case in Mississippi. Often, if you do fit the criteria, you have to vote in front of a clerk, and that makes it much more complicated to do it. When we're going to talk about apportionment in a minute, reapportionment, which is right back in the news again. There were fewer hearings in Mississippi for reapportionment, mostly held in the evenings, so it was harder for people to attend. And in other states where there may be many, many, many opportunities to participate in those discussions, there were much fewer here. So there have been very concrete impacts of this. So where is it with the court now? I want to talk about 3 cases. I won't get deep in the weeds, but the first is the Baranovich DNC case in 2021. This is looking at 2 Arizona cases that were challenged, or policies that were challenged as being racially discriminatory. One had kind of required that if you cast a ballot in the wrong precinct, accidentally, precinct changes, you moved, but you cast a ballot in the wrong precinct, your vote would be immediately thrown out. Now, understandably, if you voted in the wrong precinct in local elections, you were voting for people you didn't have the right to vote for. But they also threw out your state and federal votes. That really wouldn't have mattered where you voted. The second was, another thing that we're seeing kind of nationally is criminalization of people who are helping other people vote, returning absentee ballots, helping people vote by mail. I know in Tennessee, it used to be when, I moved to Tennessee from here in 2013, and when we were doing Get Out the Votes, we would have places on campus where students could, because Tennessee's very long, our students don't get home as frequently as they were able to when I taught at Jackson State. They could go home very easily for a weekend. Doesn't happen in Tennessee that way. So they would register, we'd help them register online for an absentee ballot, and then we'd put it in the mail for them. Well, that became a felony. Can't do that anymore. We can set up a computer for them to do it themselves and give them a stamp, but we can't help. So, so this is one of those criminalization cases. And so this was the first time the Supreme Court was really looking at Section 2. Which deals with these time, place, and manner of voting rules, saying that they can't have disparate impact racially. And the court basically came up with these kinds of 5 principles to say, what do we consider in making these decisions? And the first is that you have to look at the size of the voter, the size of the burden on voters beyond mere inconvenience. So it can't just be making voter a little harder, it has to actually burden the right to vote. The second was, it was the law departing from standard practice. This is something very different from what was being done when Section 2 was initially amended in 1982. The third is the size of the disparity, because what Justice Alito says in his opinion is what they're really looking at is that the political process must be equally open to minority and majority and non-minority groups alike. You have to compare those two groups and say, is there a disparity? And then how large is that disparity? And then are there other means of voting than the one that's being burdened by the policy? Do you have other options? And then finally, is the state's interest in doing this? Is there a legitimate state interest in creating these policies that burden? So that's what happened in this case. It was a narrowing of Section 2, but not an overturning of it. So this leads to these ongoing forms of voter suppression that we're seeing kind of nationally. Two for Mississippi worth talking about. One is lifetime felony disenfranchisement. That has been in the Constitution since 1890, where, you know, Dr. McLemore pointed out, was clearly stated, and you can read it in the debates, that the purpose was to target Black voters and to make them less likely to be able to vote. And today, as a result of this, just under 16% of the Black voting population is permanently disenfranchised due to felonies, and 11% of the entire population in Mississippi is permanently disenfranchised. This is not related to the Voter Rights Act of 1965. It hasn't fallen under it. And there's been lots of federal lawsuits to challenge it. They've been unsuccessful, and there's been multiple attempts by the state legislature to change it, and that's also been unsuccessful. The second thing to really think about that's recent in Mississippi is voting purges. That if you miss one election, regardless of reason, you can be purged from voter rolls. And when you give states the power to do this, you often don't know you've been purged, and you don't know why you've been purged, which makes it very difficult to challenge. So these are ongoing issues. And then two last things, and then we want to open this up for discussion. One is the Allen versus Milligan case, which is another this is 2023, and the court again reconsiders Section 2. And every time they reconsider Section 2, we take a collective deep breath to see what's going to happen. And this was a case where Alabama redistricted, and the lower court found that they had unlawfully violated the VRA by diluting the votes of Black residents. And the court said that they have the ability, citizens can challenge, because this is one of the pushes, you know. This Eighth Circuit has a rule in their circuit that individuals cannot challenge unlawful activities dealing with voting under Section 2. They cannot individually sue. You can't challenge it that way. They're the only circuit in the country that has that ruling. And in Allen versus Milligan, the court made it clear that they were not willing to extend that to the nation. They weren't willing to overturn it for the Eighth Circuit, but they weren't willing to extend it. And so, yeah, so it's kind of been a little bit in limbo since then. We just found out there's a similar case coming up out of Louisiana. And the court has just announced, I think a day or two ago, that they were going to hear that case. And so they were asking for arguments on both sides regarding regarding Section 2. So again, will Section 2 be upheld, or will this be an opportunity the court will use to overturn it? It's not clear. One thing worth noting, I think, in this opinion is who the majority was. The majority in Allen versus Milligan was Chief Justice Roberts, who wrote Shelby. And he was joined by Kagan, Jackson, Sotomayor, and Kavanaugh. And so that's the five right now who are kind of upholding Section 2. All right. This is us in 97, so you can, we've been together a while. So we're excited to talk about this with you, what questions you have. You'll find we don't always agree with each other, which makes this extra fun. What are you thinking about?
Testing. There we go.
Good afternoon, Dr. McLemore. To everybody, the Voting Rights Act, correct me if I'm off cue here, has to be authorized every 25 years. It was approved in 2005, I guess, which means it's coming up in 2031. What's your expectations?
Given the current climate and given the thinking of the current administration, hopefully they won't be there then. But the answer would be there's a strong opposition to not renewing it, quite frankly. So I wouldn't be surprised, but clearly there's going to be an uprising from the voices of the people across the country. And I expect Mississippi will lead the way. We will be the loudest voices to say, let's maintain the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And since I have the microphone in my hand, I had planned to devote my remarks to the memory and life and work of the late Robert Major Walker, who passed away recently. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you.
I think one of the tensions we're seeing right now is that the argument we're seeing from those who want to diminish the Voting Rights Act or end the Voting Rights Act is an argument that the right to vote is an individual right that should be unrelated to racial identity. And they point to the one man, one vote argument, right? Which is a court-created notion from the 60s. The problem is that this is an incredibly ahistorical argument, right? It ignores the whole history we've just talked about. It ignores why the Voting Rights Act was created. And I think this is part of a larger trend that we ignore our past, and we don't know our past, and we don't know our history. We tell we're watching an administration that's explicitly doing this, rewriting that history, that public history. So this isn't known. So then it becomes a lot easier for people to say, well, why do we need that in the past? Because they don't understand the past that created it and that requires it.
Hello. My main concern is related to just that, focusing on this administration's effort to prevent people, to wipe out the DEI programs. And this past election, I was surprised at how many young people did not feel it was important to vote. And for me, knowing the history, it just really touched something in me to feel that that they did not feel it was important for them to vote. So had any thoughts, well, I would appreciate thoughts on how we can, for some of them, they can't even hear you if try to reason with them, but what are we gonna do about this?
Well, we need to do a lot, but I think next Wednesday, Ori and Jeannie Militant are going to talk about Mississippi Conflict and Change, the book that has been banned by the Mississippi textbooks people. It was banned initially when it was published, but we need to do more political education. We need to do more community education. And I just wish everybody who heard me say whatever I said, if you would remember the words of V.O. Key Jr. in 1949. Just remember that Mississippi is Mississippi because of the presence of so many African American people in the population. I mean, Henry Kirksey, Senator Kirksey, God bless his soul, was exactly right years and years ago when he pointed out that the higher we vote, the higher they vote, but if we don't vote, then we don't win. We don't do anything. So, but education is the key, but then the young people don't know that history. They don't know that history. They don't know that history. They don't know that in 1961, I'm repeating myself, but in 1961, Bob Moses and those two guys went to Macomb. They don't know that. They don't know that in 1954, Medgar Evers decided to head up the charge in Mississippi for the NAACP. And then I talked about 54 to 61, but just think about all of the characters that worked with Medgar Evers in those 7 years. Just think about all of the men and women who became branch presidents of the NAACP in Mississippi. All of those people that Jeff Kolnick talked about, the unknown people, the people who actually made the movement. That's the story that we need to tell. So thank God we have this museum that is telling part of that story. And give the museum a round of applause. Come on. So it seems to me that we have to do this education on a variety of platforms, and in order for these young people to realize what happened, in order for them to have all of the privileges that they have today.
And I think the other thing is, as someone who's still in the classroom, for young people today, the only politics they know is politics post-2016. That's it. That's the democracy they know. And yeah, that should give shivers down your spine, because that kind of polarization, the inability of people to find political solutions to real problems, the ability of protest to make significant change, the history that we know, the America that we know, the possibilities we know, and therefore the hope we can have for that younger generation, it's not there. And so there is a cynicism, and I'm teaching political science majors, there's a cynicism that political solutions may not be the solutions. And so for many, the tendency is then to withdraw from all of it. And that, to me, is the big risk that we're facing, is how do we help them have political hope so they get involved and engage and make change?
I have a question. Statement. May I? My 32 years in the state senate here in Mississippi, there were a time when the session was over, we were invited to the schools to teach a student how a bill becomes a law. That has stopped. Everybody locked down. Okay, and those who are not for everybody voting love this kind of nonsense. But I wrote a bill, character education, where we go into the school and we tell how a bill becomes a law, and students learn that. We're not doing our part because schools are locked down now. No one is talking to the students, and here we're drifting back to the same old segregation that we just haven't quite gotten out of. So let's wake up and open the schools up, and let's let legislators go back and teach how a bill becomes a law. And those who came along with voter ID, those are the ones that have been against certain people voting. All of us know that. So we're not doing our job as a state for opening up the system so young people who coming along don't get that chance to communicate with legislators because the system doesn't want it to happen. Thank you.
I appreciate those comments very much. I just want to say, someone who just left the classroom, I really like these young people. You know, I taught 33 years, and the young people that we have right now, they could be, you could see it as cynical, you could see they're incredibly open-minded. They know something's broken, and they want to see it fixed. And so they are extraordinarily open-minded. And I would just say, you know, they don't know that history because we're not teaching that history as effectively as we could. We could put Fannie Lou Hamer on the standardized test, and they would teach Fannie Lou Hamer if she was a box to check on the standardized test. If she's not, they're not going to teach it. So there's lots of problems in the schools, but I love these young people. Of all the generations of young people I taught, I like these ones. And so I just think that we got to fix as much as we can, but I have great hope in these young people. I love them. Yeah. Not like Jeffrey Epstein, but in a different way.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know we have a number of questions that we're not going to be able to get all to this afternoon, but before we're going to wrap here in just a few moments, but Dr. McLemore, Dr. Kolnick, and Dr. Deardorff would be happy to answer your questions. So please stay around, grab another cup of coffee, come, and they're going to kind of be over at their table here on the right side of the stage. And so please come, ask them questions. We'd love for you to have that. But one more time, let's give them a round of applause. I also want to make note before we wrap up, just to thank the Southern Poverty Law Center. You see that one-page report that's on your tables. They were able to provide lunch for us today, so thank you again. We look forward to seeing you guys again next week for the Emmett Till Interpretive Center on August 13th. Thank you guys. Y'all have a great day.